Welcome to Creation in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Carl Baugh, founder and director of the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. Now, the title to today's program is most appropriate since this is a program of contemplation, data, information. The title to today's program is Hard Questions for Creationists. How do we explain the interplay of all of the living systems, the background of the supporting universe, the division of bacteria that biodegrade living systems once they have ceased to live? How do we explain the interplay of tide, sun, moon, living systems? Well, they're hard questions and they do deserve answers. Having been a student for some decades, a student of the conflict of naturalism versus supernaturalism, there was a time in the past when I held to naturalistic explanations for life origins. There was a time when I thought atheistic thoughts. There was a time when I held to creation, but long age progressive creation, adopting the geologic column because I thought it was based in factual information. Well, most people in the public, because of the predominance of naturalistic evolutionary concept, philosophy in the press and in the academic profile, most people believe that evolution has occurred, that there are billions of years in universal history. Now, God is forever. He inhabits eternity. But what are the real facts? And you deserve some real answers. When we begin to contemplate this matter of creation versus evolution, no one can think of any third alternative. Either we arrived by a naturalistic process or a divine being used the naturalistic process, or we arrived by a supernatural process. Now, there are variations within these profiles. There are many fine individuals who hold to creation, but hold to long geologic ages, hold to long cosmological universal ages as well. There are those who intermarry that with a theistic evolutionary profile, which adopts evolution, but states that's the way God used, that's the method God used to bring us to our current state of affairs. But basically, there are just two camps: naturalism and supernaturalism, evolution and creation. Now, let's define terms. On this program, I very often, when using the term evolution, am persuaded, in fact, impelled to define a term. For instance, microevolution is no problem whatsoever. Microevolution is variation within genetic boundaries. We have many illustrations of that. I have children, they're all different, yet they're the same genetic stock. We have the bovine characteristics. You have cows that have a specialization within an area to produce a leaner beef or a more marvel beef or a greater bulk or greater milk production. But that's all within the genetic boundaries of the bovine kind. And when you isolate those genetic points of information to produce a singular expression, which in itself may appear to be superior, when you isolate, you limit the gene pool. That's microevolution, variation within genetic boundaries. But the normal term evolution infers macroevolution. That is the concept of amoeba to man, of the assemblage by mutation or some other method, the assemblage of new beneficial information that'll produce a serious and a superior. Serious because of an upward progress in the evolutionary profile, superior because ultimately it would lead to man. That's the basic concept. Now, creationist, and I am a creationist. Not only am I a creationist, I'm a recent creationist. By that I mean, I hold the creation of the universe and the world all within scientific and biblical chronology, all within a few thousand years. Well, now, wait a minute. If you hold to that position, there's some real questions we'd like to ask. All right, now's the time to ask those questions. Some hard questions for creationists would first of all be, number one, what about the geologic column? Well, let's talk about the geologic column. It's expressed here as an ever-ascending, progressive, superior, new information gathering program that produces ever-ascending complexity in living systems, beginning with bacteria that, according to evolutionary persuasion, first developed about 3.5 billion years ago, and the living systems, the bottom dwellers, first developed after that on planet Earth in the ecosphere. Continuing, we come up to, that's called the Paleozoic era. We come to the Mesozoic era, which is the age of the dinosaurs, introducing the Cenozoic era, the age of the mammals, and ultimately producing man. So, the first legitimate question would be, what about the geologic column? Well, what most people do not know is this column is not found anywhere on the face of the globe except in the mind of the philosophic evolutionist. Now let me say that again. You won't find that column anywhere on planet Earth. In fact, where you find systematic layers of sedimentary deposits, quite often you'll find this era enfolding in this one, enfolding in this one, totally in contradiction to the evolutionary profile. The geologic column was invented to make it appear that evolution had occurred from simple life forms to complex life forms, ever increasing in their stature and their ultimate dominance in the ecosphere. So it's a legitimate question. What about the geologic column? The concept is, the evolutionary concept is, that you first had simplistic and very simple life forms. Oh, really? At the very bottom of the geologic column, after bacteria, and by the way, the bacteria is a problem because bacteria must feed on decaying systems that were once alive. But here you have bacteria in what's supposed to be, at least is assigned, 3.5 billion year old material in sedimentary deposits. Wow, that's a major problem for this geologic column. And by the way, you cannot prove that any rock is any older than any other rock. You simply have to assign them a place, expecting that to occur, but it's never found anywhere on the face of the earth. Back to the complexity of living forms. At the bottom of the ocean dwellers, you have the trilobites in the fossil record. Trilobites, three-lobed creatures with compound eyes. Those eyes were bulbous in that they were able to see 360 degrees all simultaneously. Wouldn't it be great for mothers to be able to prove that they have eyes in the backs of their heads? Well, they really don't, but a child thinks they do. However, a trilobite had a 360-degree profile with which it could see in compound eyes, not simple eyes, compound eyes, more complicated than the cameras that photographed our men on the moon some years ago. Wow! So this is a contradiction. The geologic column exists in a few places in that you'll have this layer and this layer and this layer. This is the Cretaceous area, referring to this last age of the dinosaurs producing T-Rex. But all of these creatures lived at the same time. In fact, we have data in the safety deposit of the Creation Evidence Museum showing that man existed at the very bottom of the geologic column. Now, let me point out something else very, very important. Interlacing all of these periods, epochs, and eras of the geologic column are polystrate fossils. What on earth is a polystrate fossil? A polystrate fossil is a fossil that extends. Normally they are plants like trees or lepidodendron, a very tender plant. They extend from one layer through a number of other layers. Even one layer plus an additional layer would make it polystrate, many, multiple layers. Now wait a minute. According to evolutionary theory, it took from 27,000 to 2 million years to form 1 inch of sedimentary deposit. Now wait a minute. If you have, as in Cookeville, Tennessee, a tree, a fossilized tree, that extends over what is assigned by evolutionary theorists 5 million years of evolutionary time, you have destroyed the geologic column. All of these were laid down in a systematic depositing of a flood. And that flood was a global flood. I returned recently from Israel. I took with me 3 credentialed geologists. Those 3 geologists examined a layer of Cretaceous rock about 4 to 4.5 feet thick. That layer of sedimentary rock was identified by evolutionist and atheistic thinker Dr. Derek Egger, the late Dr. Egger, a world-class geologist and geophysicist, who found evidence that that layer is global in nature. It extends throughout the United States, throughout Canada, throughout Central and South America, picks up again from the eastern seaboard of the United States, picks up again at the White Cliffs of Dover, runs throughout Europe, Scandinavia, throughout Asia, throughout Russia, runs throughout Israel, runs throughout Africa, from the United States, runs south through South America, and it is found on the Australian continent. What I'm saying is there was a global flood, and this geologic column was a systematic layering, day after day, week after week, a systematic layering of flood deposit, and is not 350 or 3.5 billion years up to recent times, but all occurred in essentially 1 year. Now that's the scientific evidence. That's not a religious, philosophic mindset. That's the scientific evidence. But let's get to another question. What about the fossil men? What about carbon dating? Oh, let's get to carbon dating first. I have here a chart indicating that in the past, before the separation of the continents, we call that the pre-flood world, the diameter of the Earth was slightly smaller, and the electromagnetic field was much stronger. That would have generated an attraction producing a canopy of some kind. Now, among creationists, we believe that, most of us believe that the canopy was waterous, aqueous in nature. Some believe it was vapor, some believe it was crystalline. I personally believe it was crystalline, consistent with the biblical record. But the point I want to make is that ultraviolet radiation streaming in the past, before the flood of Noah's day, would be interrupted. Now that is incredibly important. Carbon-14 is normally the immediate answer to say that some fossil is quite old, and the press has a heyday saying, according to carbon dating, this fossil that was found is 40,000 years old. But in the creation model, strict, biblical, scientific, recent creationists hold that the entire universe is but a few thousand years old. How do we explain that? The half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,700 years. I say about 5,700 because depending on pressure and temperature alterations, it can vary just slightly. After 7 half-lives, all radioactive material of a given isotope have been expended. Now, that means that at the outside, carbon-14 could only give you an age of 50 to 60,000 years. However, there are 2 other carbon molecules, atoms, carbon atoms that work in molecular form. Carbon-12 and carbon-13. Carbon-14 is the only one that's radioactive. Carbon-14 is artificially generated as ultraviolet radiation strikes the upper atmosphere, strikes nitrogen, a chain reaction sets in, producing carbon-14. Living systems assimilate the carbon-14, and it begins to decay, and half of it's gone in about 5,700 years. If we find a fossil, since we know that a few thousand years ago, and these are scientific data, a few thousand years ago, the Earth's magnetic field was much stronger, which would have shielded out most of the ultraviolet radiation. Now, did you get that? That means that a few thousand years ago, very little carbon-14 would have been generated. So if you find a fossil that has very little carbon-14, that essentially means that that fossil is not tens of thousands of years old, but was deposited somewhere near the time when that canopy collapsed and when that field began to dissipate. So carbon-14 is not really a problem at all. When properly interpreted, it gets within the range of a few thousand years. Oh, by the way, I read a technical report recently which showed that they have found carbon-14. Physicists have found at least a dozen specimens of carbon-14 in diamond. Now, wait a minute. The diamond is supposed to be 300 million years old on average. All of those ages are simply assigned. How could carbon-14, which loses half its mass in 5,700 years and in a few tens of thousands of years would have lost all its mass under these conditions, how could it remain intact from diamond 300,000 years? It's absolutely impossible. What we're saying is something is askew. It all is matched by the creation model. Carbon-14 is therefore explained and explained academically inadequately. Now, what about those missing links? What about development of the lemurs to more complicated primates, lower primates, to intermediate, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and ultimately to man with his incredible ability to reflect upon the universe? What about that? Oh, before Dr. Richard Leakey died, he admitted that he had found bones of totally modern human beings in the same layer where he had found bones that he had originally interpreted to be from lower primates developing to human beings, meaning that those life forms are specific. Apes are still apes, chimpanzees are still chimpanzees, man is still man and always has been man. So along with those supposed ancestors of man, you have actually modern specimens of man. That blows the development. Well, what about variation? I wrote a book some years ago titled Panorama of Creation. In it, I illustrated 4 types of man that have been found. First, protomeric man, superior man, pre-flood. There's indication that superior man knew how to use physics better than our best laboratories today. For instance, we have a hammer in safety deposit at Glenrose. That hammer is 96.6% iron, 0.74% sulfur, and 2.6% chlorine. But you can't do that. Our best physics laboratories can, one atom at a time, change the valence attraction and can alter the weight of an element, but only one atom at a time. Here we have an entire hammer that was used, that was, by the way, buried in Cretaceous flood deposits. Cretaceous is assigned from 140 million up to 64 million years ago. Simply assigned those ages. Wow, man didn't supposedly evolve until about 2.5 million years ago in primitive form. How could he, back with the dinosaurs, if evolution is true, how could he pose a hammer and compose the elements in elemental transfer? Absolutely impossible. if evolution is true. So the creationists have an answer to this problem of the development of man. Superior man lived first. After the flood, he was still superior. He spoke with complicated language expression. But then I listed, now that is Proto-Meric man, a general Meric classification. Then I listed Isolomeric man, man who deliberately isolates himself, and in 3 generations we have characteristics that appear to be rather primitive because he doesn't have access to the rest of the culture. Then I gave a designation of Phobiomeric man, man who by his phobias and aversions deliberately isolated himself. Isolomeric man was isolated geographically due to catastrophes, but Phobiomeric man isolated himself deliberately due to his own phobias, fears, and aversions. And then that leads us to modern man. Yet, we find ancient cultures extremely sophisticated. For instance, a little doll was found among remains of Neanderthal man. A little doll with braided hair in 2 areas. Perfect features. In the same general time, Magdalenian man was found in Russia, and supposedly it was 12 to 14,000 years old, that culture, yet they had painted jewelry, they had earrings, they had knives as sophisticated as our neighbors might use or as we might use under isolated or primitive conditions, not totally primitive, just isolated temporarily. I'm saying that you have superior characteristics found throughout the geologic column, and the geologic column does not represent long eras of time. Then that brings us to another valid question. What about deep time in deep space? If light traveling at 186,000 miles per second, and technically it's 186,284.0244866 miles per second, light traveling at that speed from Doppler redshift indications would take sometime billions of years to reach planet Earth. Well, what's the answer to that for the creationist? In Psalm 102 and 104 we have an expression, and in Isaiah we have the expression, where God stretched out the heavens. We have the same data information in Psalm again in Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22, describing the flood event when God stretched out the heavens. Einstein demonstrated that if you alter space, stretching out the heavens, you alter mass, you alter time. Thus, within the framework, the biblical framework of thousands of years, the explanation is adequately given that all the dimensions of the space, time, mass continuum can be explained, providing there's a creator to do it. And the evidence is there was and is a creator capable of doing that. Now, one final question. Hard questions for creationists, and they should be addressed, but questions that have answers. Final question. What about the dinosaurs? Now, I excavate dinosaurs, I dig dinosaurs. I've had the privilege of discovering and directing the excavation of 15 different dinosaurs, or components of 15 different dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are used by the evolutionary community to illustrate the brute behavior of specimens back in the Mesozoic era from 228 to 64 million years ago. Yet, the facts are that those dinosaurs were a vital part of the creation model. Due to the filtration of ultraviolet and due to the smaller diameter of the earth, in the world before the flood, plants grew luxuriantly. In fact, lepidodendron is a plant that today gets 16, 18 inches tall as a lycopsid club moss, but in the fossil record, it got up to 120 feet tall. Wow, you would need the dinosaurs, you would need them to keep the vegetation in check. And by the way, recently, a credentialed evolutionary researcher found soft tissue and blood vessels inside a T-Rex bone. All indications should show that it's very recent, all within the creation time frame. And that brings us to you. Since there are adequate answers that creationists can give, academic answers in addition to biblical answers, if there is viable evidence for creation, and there is, that points to a creator. Are you right with that creator? Do you know him personally? You can know him. He walked among men, sat in our councils. We put him to death. He went to Calvary, shed his blood, died for our sins. We placed him in a tomb, but he arose from that grave, and he lives today knocking at your heart's door. Would you just simply open your heart and pray this prayer? Pray it with me. Dear God, I'm a sinner. Thank you for sending Jesus Christ, your Son, to die for me. I want him in my heart. Lord Jesus, right now, I open my heart to you. Come in right now. Save me forever, and I will live for you with all my heart. Once Jesus Christ is there, you found the real answer for all eternity.
Creation in the 21st Century has been sponsored by Trinity Broadcasting Network, and only with your love gift of support can this program stay on the air. So write to Creation in the 21st Century, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.
Information like you've received today is available at the Creation Evidence Museum. In printed form, in videos, we even have a coloring book for the kids. Just call or write us at Creation Evidence Museum, P.O. Box 309, Glen Rose, Texas, 76043, area code 254-897-3200, or check us out on the web, creationevidence.org.